The sound of clinking glasses still lingers in my mind, not because of celebration, but because of the way silence followed right after. It was at a dinner table that should have been filled with warmth, laughter, and comfort, yet I found myself frozen, the weight of a single glance pressing down on me more than any words could. Mark's eyes met mine across the table, steady but distant, as if he were already living another life outside of our home. And then, a careless comment from Tessa, his closest friend, who had somehow become an ever-present figure in our marriage, cut through me like a whisper meant to sting. That was the moment I understood something wasn't right, even if I didn't yet have the courage to say it aloud. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one, stories about betrayal, justice, and the strength it takes to reclaim your dignity. My name is Elena Brooks, and for most of my life, I believed I had built the kind of family others envied. I grew up in a small town where loyalty and hard work were the highest values, where neighbors brought casseroles during tough times, and children were raised to believe that marriage meant forever. By the time I met Mark, I was already steady in my career as a school counselor, guiding troubled teenagers through the storms of adolescence. He was ambitious, always chasing the next promotion in sales, and his energy drew me in like fire in the cold. Together, we built a life that looked secure from the outside, a home in the suburbs, a daughter who was the heart of my world, and traditions that seemed unshakable. For years, I convinced myself that our differences balanced us. Where I was measured, Mark was bold. Where I preferred quiet evenings, he thrived on being surrounded by friends, and no one was closer to him than Tessa. She had been around since our early marriage, a woman who claimed to be his sounding board, his confidant. I tried not to mind her presence, brushing off the unease I felt when her laughter rang a little too loud at his jokes, or when her hand lingered on his arm just a second too long. She was part of his world, and by extension, mine. Our daughter Lily was the light that kept me grounded. She grew up watching me pour into my students by day and into our home by night. She was thoughtful and quick to notice the small things, a habit she no doubt inherited from me. When she was little, she would crawl into my lap and say she wanted a love like ours someday. At the time, my heart swelled with pride, certain we had given her an example of loyalty and strength. Looking back now, I wonder if the cracks had already begun to form, quiet hairline fractures beneath the surface. On birthdays and anniversaries, Mark always liked to host gatherings. He thrived on showing the world a version of us that seemed picture perfect, and I played along, setting the table with my best china and smiling through the evening. Yet as the years passed, those nights felt more like performances than celebrations. I became the woman behind the scenes, ensuring everything looked right, while Mark and Tessa charmed the room. I told myself it didn't matter, that the family we built together was worth every small sacrifice. But deep down, I felt the hollow echo of being overlooked. The night of Walter's retirement dinner should have been a moment of unity. Mark's father had worked his whole life as a contractor, building homes from the ground up with calloused hands and quiet pride. We gathered at a grand hall, family and friends seated under crystal chandeliers, the air rich with nostalgia. I wore my best dress, smoothing it nervously as Mark raised a glass to honor his father's years of sacrifice. I smiled and clapped with everyone else, but when his toast shifted from Walter to the people who truly supported him, my breath caught. He named Tessa before he named me. The applause swelled, but inside, I felt something collapse. I kept my composure that night, as I always had, smiling for the photographs and greeting relatives who told me how lucky I was. But later, lying in bed while Mark snored beside me, I stared at the ceiling and replayed every moment. His eyes on Tessa, her knowing smile, the way I had become invisible in the very family I helped hold together. Something in me shifted then. It was small, barely a whisper, but it was the beginning of a storm I could no longer ignore. And that's where my story truly begins, with a single toast, a single omission, and a realization that I could no longer stay silent. Because once you've been erased in front of a room full of people, you start to wonder how long you've been erased in private. And wondering has a way of uncovering truths you wish you'd never seen. The weeks after Walter's retirement dinner should have been quiet, but the silence in our house grew heavy in ways I couldn't ignore. Mark went about his routines with the same polished smile, but his attention seemed elsewhere. I told myself it was work, the constant pressure to close deals and prove himself, but deep down, I knew better. Every time his phone lit up on the counter, I noticed how quickly he reached for it, angling the screen away from me, as though protecting something fragile. At first, I tried to brush it aside. After all, Mark had always been social, his work and personal life overlapping in a blur of contacts, calls, and late-night dinners. But when the name that flashed across his phone was Tessa's more often than not, I couldn't keep dismissing the knot in my chest. She wasn't just his friend anymore. She had become a shadow, stretching into every corner of our marriage. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to drive over to my in-laws' house with Lily. Patricia welcomed us warmly, setting out her famous lemon bars and asking Lily about her college applications. It was a moment of comfort. I hadn't realized I needed the steady presence of a woman who had built her life on caring for others. But even in that kitchen, with sunlight spilling across the table, I caught a glimpse of how tangled things had become. When Mark's name came up, Patricia's smile faltered. "He's been spending a lot of time with that Tessa, hasn't he?" she asked, carefully glancing toward the hallway where Walter sat dozing in his recliner. I froze, my fork hovering above the plate. Patricia must have noticed the flicker in my expression because she quickly added, "I didn't mean anything by it. I'm sure it's all harmless." But her voice carried the kind of doubt that comes from experience, not gossip. Lily looked between us, sensing the tension, though she said nothing. I smoothed my daughter's hair, forcing a smile, but my heart thudded with unease. That evening, Mark returned home later than usual. He loosened his tie in the doorway, smelling faintly of wine and perfume that wasn't mine. "Long dinner with clients," he said breezily, kissing the top of my head before disappearing into the shower. I sat at the kitchen table long after the water stopped running, staring at the empty plate he hadn't touched. Something inside me whispered that I couldn't keep looking the other way. The first undeniable crack appeared a few days later. I had left my phone charger in Mark's car, and when I went to retrieve it, I saw a folded piece of paper tucked between the seats. It was an invoice from a catering company addressed to Tessa. The date matched the evening Mark claimed he had been at a business dinner. My hands trembled as I held the paper, the truth pressing against me like cold glass. When I confronted him that night, I didn't lead with accusations. Instead, I asked how the meeting with his clients had gone. He launched into a story about negotiations, speaking with a little too much ease. Finally, I placed the invoice on the table. His face blanched just for a second before he leaned back in his chair with a practiced sigh. "Tessa needed help organizing an event," he said. I was just being a friend. The lie was smooth, but it didn't erase the image of him rushing to hide his phone or the perfume I had smelled on his shirt. I didn't argue that night. Instead, I nodded, cleared the dishes, and let the silence settle thick around us. But inside, the hurt deepened. He hadn't just dismissed me at that dinner table weeks ago. He had been slowly dismissing me for much longer. Lily noticed the shift between us. One evening, as she worked on an essay at the kitchen counter, she asked quietly, "Are you and Dad okay?" I wanted to shield her, to say everything was fine, but the words stuck in my throat. "We're figuring things out," I told her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She gave me a long look, wise beyond her years, before nodding and returning to her work. The following weekend, Mark invited Tessa over under the guise of planning a charity gala. I watched from the kitchen as they sat together on the couch, their laughter spilling into the room like an unwelcome draft. Tessa's hand rested casually on his arm, and though Mark shifted slightly, he didn't move away. When she finally left, I stood at the sink washing glasses, the hot water burning my skin, though I barely felt it. Mark came up behind me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Don't read into things," he murmured. His tone was gentle, but it carried the weight of dismissal. That night, I lay awake beside him staring at the ceiling. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it seeps in quietly through small lies and withheld truths, until one day you realize the foundation you thought was solid has already begun to crumble. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I could no longer ignore the signs. The late nights, the evasive answers, the way Tessa's presence had grown from occasional visits to constant interruptions, it was all leading me toward a truth I wasn't ready to face. But the moment was coming, and deep down, I knew it would break whatever illusions I had left about the life I thought we shared. The weeks that followed felt like living inside a house where the lights were on, but no one was home. Mark moved through our days with a calm exterior, but I could sense the distance growing. He would sit at the kitchen counter pretending to scroll through emails, though I caught the faintest smile tug at his mouth when his phone buzzed. It was the kind of smile a man doesn't make for work, and it sliced me deeper each time. I tried to keep our home steady for Lily. She was in the middle of senior year, her schedule packed with college applications, essays, and rehearsals for her school play. I filled the fridge with her favorite snacks, helped her polish essays late at night, and cheered from the audience during dress rehearsals. Yet no matter how much I tried to shelter her, she noticed. Children always notice. When Mark missed one of her performances claiming a business dinner, Lily's disappointment hung in the air, long after the curtain fell. She didn't say it aloud, but her eyes found mine, as if to ask why her father had drifted away. At night, I carried my grief quietly. I would lie awake beside Mark, staring at the ceiling while he slept soundly, and wonder when love had shifted into indifference. I replayed the years we had shared, the young couple who once stayed up until dawn, dreaming of the life we would build, the parents who painted Lily's nursery together, with laughter on their lips. Those memories had become ghosts I clung to, whispering that maybe things could return to what they had been. But reality was unrelenting. The man beside me was slipping further out of reach. The hardest part was the pretense. At family gatherings, Mark still held my hand in front of others, his grip steady, his smile flawless. To anyone watching, we were solid, a couple rooted in years of devotion. But when the guests left and the lights dimmed, he released my hand as if it had burned him. I kept playing the role of a supportive wife, though each performance chipped away at my spirit. There is a particular pain in being invisible to the person who once saw every part of you. I avoided Patricia's knowing eyes whenever we visited. She never asked directly, but her silences spoke louder than questions ever could. Walter, kind and gentle, seemed unaware of the storm brewing, though once when Mark left the room, he squeezed my hand and said softly, "You're stronger than you think." It startled me, that quiet reassurance. I carried those words back home like a secret shield, even as the cracks widened in my marriage. The breaking point arrived quietly, not with a fight, but with a whisper that wasn't meant for me. Mark had left his phone on the nightstand one evening, and when it buzzed, I glanced at the screen. The preview of a message glowed in the dim light, Tessa's name bold at the top. The words were simple, but they hollowed me out. "I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore." My breath caught and the world tilted under me. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I slipped the phone back where it was and sat in the living room with a blanket pulled tight around my shoulders. The hours crept by as I listened to the rhythm of his breathing in the next room, steady and untroubled. My tears came silently, not in sobs, but in a slow stream I could no longer hold back. By morning, my face was stiff from crying, and my body ached from sitting upright in the dark. When Lily left for school that day, she paused at the door, studying me with quiet worry. "Mom," she said gently, "you don't have to pretend with me." Her words broke something in me, but I only kissed her forehead and told her to have a good day. I couldn't let her carry the weight of my heartbreak, not yet. The days that followed blurred together. I kept moving, attending meetings at school, folding laundry, cooking dinner, as though maintaining order could keep me from unraveling. But every small moment reminded me of what I had lost. The empty space on Mark's side of the closet when he left for overnight trips, the way his laughter now rang louder when Tessa was near, the ache in my chest, when I realized he hadn't looked at me with love in months. At night, I found myself wandering the house long after everyone was asleep. I would linger in the doorway of Lily's room, watching her breathe peacefully, and wonder if she knew how much I was trying to shield her from. Then I would retreat to the kitchen, sit at the table with a cup of tea gone cold, and let the silence press against me until I felt small enough to vanish. The word that haunted me most wasn't betrayal, it was replacement. The quiet terror that someone else had stepped into the space I once filled. That all the years I had poured into my marriage, the sacrifices, the devotion could be erased, as if they were nothing. That realization hollowed me in ways I hadn't known possible. Still, I said nothing. I carried the secret like a stone in my chest, too heavy to put down, too dangerous to drop in front of Lily. But in the silence, my resolve began to shift. I wasn't ready to confront them yet, but the quiet ache was sharpening into something steadier. The more invisible I became to Mark, the more clearly I began to see myself. And though my nights were still filled with tears, somewhere inside a faint ember began to burn. It whispered that pain could become clarity, and clarity could become strength. I didn't know then how far that ember would carry me, but I knew the days of silence were numbered. Because once you've heard the truth in someone else's whisper, it becomes impossible to unhear it. And I had heard enough to know that my world would never be the same again. The morning after I read Tessa's message on Mark's phone, something inside me felt different. I was still broken, but the silence no longer paralyzed me. Instead, it sharpened into a kind of clarity I hadn't known before. For weeks, I had been carrying the weight of his betrayal like a stone pressed into my chest. That morning, I set the stone down. I looked at Mark across the breakfast table, his hair still damp from the shower, and realized I wasn't afraid anymore. He asked about Lily's plans for the day, his voice smooth and practiced, but I barely heard him. My mind had moved somewhere else entirely, to the space beyond heartbreak where decisions are born. I folded the newspaper carefully, the motion steady, almost ceremonial, and said I had a meeting at the school later. He nodded without interest, already scrolling his phone again. I left the table knowing I was done, waiting for him to see me. That afternoon, I sat in my office at the high school, surrounded by the clutter of lesson plans and old student drawings pinned to the corkboard. For years, I had poured myself into this work, guiding teenagers who felt unseen. Now, for the first time, I realized I was one of them, overlooked, dismissed, treat it as background in my own marriage. My hands shook slightly as I reached for the phone, but not with fear. I was calling Harold Kim, the chairman of the education fund I had volunteered with for years. Harold answered warmly, asking how I was doing, and before I could second-guess myself, I told him the truth. I said I wanted to take on a larger role with the fund, something beyond the school walls, something that would give me independence. He paused, then said he had been waiting for me to say those words. "You've always been capable of more." "Elena," he told me, "let's find a way to make it happen." When I hung up, a quiet sense of power spread through me. It was small, but it was mine. That night, I didn't cry. Instead, I sat with a notebook at the kitchen table while Mark tapped away at his laptop across the room. He didn't ask what I was writing, and I didn't offer. I listed what I wanted, not from him, but from myself. Stability for Lily as she finished school. A new position that gave me control of my own future. And most of all, the strength to stop playing the part of the invisible wife. Days slipped into weeks, and the tension in the house thickened. Mark spent more nights away, claiming client dinners or late meetings. I no longer asked questions. I poured my energy into the fund, working with Harold on proposals that might bring in new scholarships for students who needed them most. With each meeting, each draft, I felt the ember inside me grow stronger. Patricia called me one evening, her voice low so Walter wouldn't overhear. "I know something's wrong," she said gently. "You don't have to tell me everything, but please remember, you don't deserve to carry this alone." Her kindness steadied me, but I kept the details to myself. I wasn't ready to reveal what I knew, not until I had the strength to face it without crumbling. Meanwhile, Lily's questions grew harder to deflect. One night, after finishing her homework, she sat on the edge of my bed and asked, "Are you and Dad going to split up?" Her eyes searched mine, hopeful and afraid at the same time. I swallowed the lump in my throat and said, "We're going to be okay, Lily. No matter what happens, you and I will always be okay." She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, and I held her until she fell asleep. That promise became my anchor. The turning point came at a community event hosted by the Education Fund. I stood at the podium to introduce Harold, scanning the audience as I spoke. My voice didn't shake. For the first time in months, I felt whole, even as I saw Mark arrive late with Tessa at his side. Their laughter carried faintly across the room, but I stayed steady, my words clear, my presence undeniable. When the applause ended, Harold whispered, "See, this is what I meant. You belong in the center, not the shadows." Driving home that night, Mark was quiet, perhaps sensing the shift in me. He commented on my speech half-heartedly, as though it surprised him to see me standing in my own light. I didn't respond. My silence said more than any words could. He wasn't the only one capable of building a new life. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling again, but this time without tears. The pain was still there, sharp and heavy, but it no longer owned me. Something inside had awakened a certainty that I could no longer ignore the truth and that I didn't have to. Because once you stop waiting to be chosen, you begin to choose for yourself. And I knew without doubt that the days of enduring in silence were over. The next step would take courage, but the ember inside me was ready to become a flame. I began moving differently in my own home, not out of fear, but with quiet calculation. Where once I had walked on eggshells, now I moved with purpose, knowing I was no longer willing to be erased. The betrayal had wounded me deeply, yet beneath the pain, there was something steadier, a determination to reclaim my dignity. It started with small choices, things Mark didn't even notice, but each one carried weight. The first step was financial. For years, my salary had flowed directly into our joint account. I told Mark I was restructuring my payroll deductions to prepare for Lily's college expenses, and he nodded distractedly, scrolling through his phone. What he didn't know was that I had opened a separate account in my own name. Each paycheck, a portion went straight there, untouchable by him. Watching the balance grow gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in a long time. The second step came through Harold. He introduced me to James Reed, an attorney who had handled matters for the education fund. I met James in his quiet office one afternoon, the walls lined with neatly framed diplomas and shelves heavy with books. I explained my situation carefully, not yet ready to say the word affair, but painting enough of the picture for him to understand. James listened without judgment, his eyes steady. When I finished, he said softly, "You don't have to decide anything today, but it's wise to prepare. Knowledge is a form of protection." He guided me through the basics: how assets could be divided, what steps I could take to secure Lily's future, and the importance of documentation. I left his office with a folder tucked beneath my arm, filled with papers that might one day become weapons, though for now they were shields. The weight of that folder reminded me that I wasn't powerless. At home, I continued my quiet routines. Mark came and went with increasing detachment, often claiming late-night client meetings that smelled faintly of Tessa's perfume when he returned. I stopped asking questions. Instead, I documented. Receipts left in his jacket pockets, unexplained charges on our statements, sudden weekend conferences. Each detail went into a binder I kept hidden at the back of my closet behind an old box of Lily's childhood toys. He had no idea that while he lived his double life, I was quietly building a record of truth. Meanwhile, Lily grew more perceptive. One evening, she found me sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by financial forms, my pen still in hand, though I hadn't written in minutes. "Mom," she said gently, "you're different lately." Her eyes held both worry and admiration. I closed the folder and reached for her hand. "I'm just making sure we're okay, no matter what happens," I told her. She squeezed my fingers, and for the first time I saw in her the same quiet strength I was beginning to rediscover in myself. Mark remained oblivious. He still believed his charm covered the gaps, still believed I was too passive to challenge him. At a dinner one evening, he laughed as he told a story to friends about how I had never been the adventurous type. They chuckled politely, but I sat silently, my fork resting against the plate, my mind already elsewhere. They saw a quiet wife. Only I knew I was becoming something else entirely. I started to build a separate circle of support colleagues, old friends I had lost touch with, even parents of former students who still remembered me with gratitude. Coffee dates, phone calls, small moments of connection that reminded me of the woman I was before Mark's shadow grew so heavy. Each conversation was a thread, and slowly I began weaving a safety net beneath myself. One afternoon, Patricia called again. Her voice carried the careful tone of someone who knew more than she said. "Elena," she asked, "are you taking care of yourself?" I hesitated before answering. "I'm trying," I said. She sighed, the kind of sigh that carries both sorrow and understanding. "Good. Just remember you have more people in your corner than you think." Her words settled into me like a quiet truth. Even Walter seemed to sense the shift. During a family gathering, he pulled me aside, his weathered hand resting gently on mine. "You remind me of your own mother," he said. "Quiet on the surface, but strong where it matters." I thanked him softly, holding back tears, knowing he didn't realize the depth of what I was carrying. By the time autumn settled in, my steps toward independence were no longer tentative. I had savings under my own name, legal guidance I could trust, and a binder of evidence that grew thicker by the week. I wasn't ready to confront Mark, not yet, but for the first time, I felt the balance shifting. Each quiet move was a stone laid in the foundation of my escape. At night, while Mark slept soundly beside me, I would open my notebook and write plans in the soft glow of the lamp. Not just lists of tasks, but visions of the life I wanted after all this was over. A home filled with peace, a future where Lily and I could breathe without the weight of pretense, and a self who no longer mistook silence for survival. Mark still saw me as predictable, but inside I was becoming something entirely new. My quiet steps were already leading toward a reckoning he never imagined. And though the confrontation had not yet come, I could feel it drawing closer, like thunder rolling in the distance before the storm breaks. The storm broke on a night that should have been ordinary. Mark came home late, his shirt wrinkled and his tie loose around his neck, carrying the kind of false ease I had come to recognize too well. He set his briefcase by the door and greeted me as if nothing were wrong, but the faint trace of perfume lingered behind him, a scent that wasn't mine. My heart no longer clenched the way it once did. Instead, I felt a calmness settle over me, as if I had been rehearsing for this moment all along. We ate in silence, Lily already at a friend's house studying. Mark scrolled through his phone between bites of dinner, chuckling quietly at messages I didn't need to ask about. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "I know about you and Tessa." The words hung in the air, deliberate and final. His fork froze halfway to his mouth, and for a long beat, he said nothing. Then he laughed a hollow, forced sound. "You're imagining things." I slid the binder I had kept hidden onto the table. Receipts, photographs, call logs, all neatly organized. His smile collapsed. He flipped through a few pages, his jaw tightening, his hands trembling, though he tried to steady them. "You've been spying on me," he asked, his voice sharp with indignation. "I've been paying attention," I corrected softly. "Something you stopped doing a long time ago." The confrontation unraveled quickly after that. He accused, deflected, tried to twist the blame back on me, but with every word I felt my resolve grow firmer. "You've humiliated me in front of our family, in front of Lily," I said quietly, "and I won't let it continue." His anger rose, his face flushed, but I no longer shrank from it. Instead, I met his fury with silence, a silence that told him the balance of power had shifted. The fallout spread fast. Denise Carter, our neighbor and an old friend, stopped by a few days later. She lowered her voice as she stood on my porch, glancing around to be sure no one overheard. "I've seen them together, Elena," she admitted. "I didn't know how to tell you before." Her words weren't news, but they were confirmation. I thanked her, grateful not for the information itself, but for the honesty I had been denied for so long. Mark, meanwhile, grew reckless. He stormed into the house one evening, his voice raised, demanding to know if I had told his parents. "Patricia called me," he snapped. "She's asking questions. You've poisoned her against me." I held his gaze and said evenly, "You managed that all on your own." He slammed the door so hard the walls shook, but the sound no longer frightened me. If anything, it underscored just how far he had fallen. Lily came home later that night, her eyes wide as she stepped into the quiet after his rage. I pulled her close, feeling the weight of her trembling against me. "Mom," she whispered, "are we going to be okay?" I smoothed her hair and answered with certainty I hadn't always felt. "Yes, we are. Because I won't let anyone take our peace away." She nodded, and I knew she believed me. That trust became my anchor. The real breaking point arrived during a family dinner at Walter and Patricia's. Mark insisted we attend together, perhaps to keep appearances, perhaps to regain control. Tessa showed up too bold to hide anymore, her hand brushing against Mark's, as if she had a right to it. The room grew tense, conversation faltering as eyes darted between us. I waited until the meal was half over, then placed my napkin gently on the table. "I think it's time everyone knows the truth," I said, my voice carrying more strength than I expected. Walter's fork stilled, Patricia's eyes widened, and Mark froze, his face draining of color. "Mark and Tessa have been carrying on behind my back," I continued, "and I won't sit here pretending otherwise." The silence that followed was sharp and suffocating. Walter finally pushed his chair back, his voice rough. "Is this true?" "Son," Mark sputtered. "Excuses." Tessa shifted uncomfortably, but the damage was done. The mask had shattered. I didn't stay to hear their explanations. I rose from the table, smoothing my dress as I stood, and said simply, "I won't be part of this performance any longer." The sound of my heels against the floor echoed through the stunned room as I walked out. Outside, the cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in years, I felt free. Mark followed me home hours later, furious and panicked. He accused me of ruining his reputation, of embarrassing him in front of his parents. I listened without a word, then handed him a copy of the legal folder James had prepared for me. "You brought this on yourself," I said calmly, "and I'm done protecting you." His shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him, and in that moment, I saw the truth. He wasn't angry because of love lost. He was angry because he had lost control. From then on, the air in our house shifted. He still tried to intimidate me, with anger still attempted to bargain with half-hearted promises, but it was too late. The power he once wielded had slipped through his fingers, and he knew it. I moved through each day with a quiet determination, securing the last of my plans, my steps leading steadily toward a new life. The storm had broken, and though the wreckage lay scattered, I stood in the center of it, unshaken. The truth was no longer hidden, the facade no longer intact. And as I looked at Mark across the wreck of what he had created, I knew the next stage was inevitable, the part where justice would no longer be silent, and his carefully built world would begin to collapse. The days after that dinner at Walter and Patricia's were like watching a carefully built house collapse one wall at a time. Mark tried to patch the damage, insisting it had been exaggerated, but the truth spread faster than his excuses. Neighbors who once admired him grew cautious. Colleagues whispered in corners, and even his parents stopped defending him. He called it betrayal when people questioned him, but it wasn't betrayal, it was consequence. I moved steadily, guided by the plans James and I had prepared. Together, we filed the paperwork that would untangle me from Mark legally and financially. Each signature felt like shedding a skin I had outgrown. Mark raged when he discovered I had already secured my own accounts, but the law was on my side, and his fury only weakened his position. For once, he couldn't charm or intimidate his way back into control. Meanwhile, Tessa's veneer of confidence began to crack. She had always thrived on appearances, arriving at gatherings in polished outfits, laughing a little too loudly at Mark's jokes. But once people knew, the admiration curdled into pity. At one event, she tried to host, only half the guests showed, and those who came whispered more than they mingled. I watched from a distance as she tried to carry herself with grace, but her eyes betrayed the humiliation she could no longer hide. Mark and I had to meet with James together one afternoon. He sat slumped in the chair across from me, his tie loosened, his bravado gone. James explained the division of assets calmly, his voice firm, leaving little room for debate. Mark interrupted, his voice sharp, accusing me of scheming. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited for him to finish. When James repeated that everything was within the law, Mark's shoulders sagged. He realized the fight was no longer his to win. At home, the silence between us grew heavier than his anger ever had. He still tried to provoke me, leaving Tessa's messages open on the counter, disappearing for nights without explanation, but I no longer responded. My calmness unsettled him more than any confrontation. Lily noticed too. She would sit beside me quietly in the evenings, working on her applications while I sorted through papers. Her presence reminded me daily why I had to keep moving forward. One evening, Patricia stopped by unannounced. She carried a container of soup, her way of showing care without words. We sat together at the kitchen table, and after a long silence, she reached across to take my hand. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have seen what was happening sooner." Her eyes glistened with tears. She quickly brushed away. "But I'm proud of you, Elena. You're standing taller than I've ever seen." Her words steadied me more than she knew. Mark's unraveling became more public as weeks passed. He missed deadlines at work, his polished charm slipping under the weight of gossip. Denise told me she overheard colleagues discussing how his judgment had faltered, how leadership was questioning his future. I listened without satisfaction, only with a sense of inevitability. He had built his reputation on control and appearances, and once those crumbled, there was little left to stand on. The final blow came when Walter confronted him directly. I wasn't there, but Patricia later recounted it with quiet sorrow. Walter had pulled Mark aside after church, his voice firm but trembling. "You were given a good life, son," he told him, "but you disrespected your wife, your family, and yourself. Don't expect us to defend what you chose." Those words, Patricia said, left Mark pale and speechless. It was one thing to lose a marriage. It was another to lose the respect of his father. At the same time, doors opened for me that I hadn't expected. Harold offered me a leadership position with the education fund, praising my resilience and clarity. "You've shown more strength than many people ever find," he said. I accepted, grateful not only for the opportunity, but for the affirmation that I was more than the shadow Mark had reduced me to. My days grew fuller, my steps more confident, and my world began to feel like mine again. By winter, the divide between us was complete. He lived more openly with Tessa, though their relationship already showed signs of strain. Lily refused to visit them, her disappointment too deep to mask. I didn't stop her from making her own choices, but I stood firmly by her side. We had weathered too much together to be pulled back into his chaos. The night the final papers were signed, I returned home to a quiet house. I set the folder on the table, exhaled, and let the silence wash over me. It wasn't the silence of grief anymore. It was the silence of freedom. The walls that once held the weight of secrets now felt lighter, as though even the house itself had exhaled. Mark's world had come crashing down not through my vengeance, but through his own undoing. I had simply stepped out of the shadows and let the truth be seen. And as I looked at Lily across the table that night, her smile small but steady, I knew we had reclaimed something far more important than a marriage. We had reclaimed our peace. Still, one step remained, the final act of closure. Justice had been served in court, in reputation, in the quiet collapse of his carefully built image. But my own heart still needed its moment of release, a moment that would mark not just his downfall, but my restoration. And I knew it was coming soon. The final papers had been signed, the argument silenced, and for the first time in years, I woke each morning without the weight of someone else's judgment pressing on my chest. The house felt different, lighter, as though the walls themselves had been waiting for peace. I found comfort in small rituals, morning coffee at the kitchen window, the steady rhythm of folding laundry, Lily humming softly as she worked on her college essays. Ordinary moments became extraordinary simply because they were free of pretense. Mark's life unraveled further once we were no longer tied together. His career faltered whispers of unreliability circling in the office where he had once thrived. Tessa stayed at his side, but her sharp edges dulled as invitations stopped arriving and clients chose other planners. They had built their lives on appearances, and without admiration, their foundation crumbled. I didn't celebrate their fall, but I didn't mourn it either. It was simply the harvest of seeds they had planted themselves. Meanwhile, my own world grew brighter. The position Harold offered me at the education fund became more than a job, it was a calling. I traveled to schools across the state meeting students whose eyes lit up when they spoke of dreams once out of reach. Each scholarship awarded, each door opened, reminded me that resilience isn't just survival, it's transformation. Patricia attended several of the events, her quiet pride a steady presence, while Walter clasped my hand one evening and said softly, "You've built something stronger than any of us could have imagined." Lily, too, found her footing. She received her acceptance letter from a university she had long dreamed of, and when we opened it together at the kitchen table, her tears of joy fell onto my shoulder. "We're going to be okay, Mom," she whispered, echoing the words I had once promised her. In that moment, I knew she no longer carried fear of our broken family. She carried hope. That was all I had ever wanted for her. As for me, I discovered that dignity isn't something given by others. It's something we claim when we refuse to be diminished. I had walked through betrayal, through nights of silence and days of doubt. But I emerged, not hardened, only clearer. Love had not destroyed me. It had revealed the strength I didn't know I carried. Life has a way of teaching us that storms do not last forever. They tear through, leaving wreckage in their path, but they also clear the ground for something new to grow. My marriage had ended, yes, but my life had begun again. In the laughter of students, in the pride of my daughter, in the quiet mornings where peace filled the air, I found what had been missing all along. If there's one lesson I carry from it all, it's this: never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on their approval. We are not defined by who fails to see us, but by how we choose to see ourselves. Dignity is not loud. It doesn't shout for attention. It stands quietly unshaken, even when the world tries to break it. Before we close, I'd love to know, has there been a moment in your life when you had to stand up for your own dignity? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.